Hey there, right on time. Come in. The candles are lit, the tea's still warm, and the archive has been creaking like it knows someone's about to open something they probably shouldn't. Mind the stack of books near the fire. That one on top's from the 1600s and still acts cursed if you breathe on it wrong. Tonight, we're opening the drawer marked vampires, not the dreamy ones. Not yet. We're starting with the early models, the bloated, red-faced grave crawlers who smelled like mildew and made medieval villagers extremely nervous. Before we dig into the dirt, literal and metaphorical, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. The archive has no clocks, and the sun hasn't visited in years, so I rely on you for time updates. If you enjoy these slow, strange, softly spoken stories about the creatures that live in old legends and even older shadows, do give this video a like. It helps others find their way here too. And if you'd like to join us for more, I'd be honored if you subscribed. And of course, if there's a particular monster, myth, or cursed footnote in history you'd like me to explore next, leave a comment. I keep a long list and a suspiciously well-labeled drawer just for requests. All right, you're wrapped in a blanket, the windows are fogged, and your neighbor, the one who was buried last week, is standing just outside the gate, looking a bit too lively. Let's rewind a few hundred years. You live in a small, damp village, the kind with one church, 12 goats, and a collective sense of dread every time the wind changes direction. People get sick. They die. And most of the time, that's the end of it. But not this time. Something feels off. The chickens won't go near the graveyard. The dog won't stop growling at the door. And your cousin, who helped bury the neighbor last week, swears he saw them standing by the well just before sunrise, which would be hard to explain considering they were definitely nailed into a coffin on Sunday. This is where the story of the vampire begins, not with castles or capes or candlelit seduction, but with a corpse that refuses to behave. Long before vampires became tragic love interests, they were bloated, red-faced, and blamed for everything, from sudden death to spoiled milk. They didn't wear silk. They didn't brood. They oozed. The original vampire, if you can even call it that, wasn't some immortal predator with a tortured soul. It was a body that didn't decompose the way it was supposed to, and for medieval villagers, that was all the evidence they needed. They didn't have forensics. They didn't understand post-mortem bloating, or the gases that made a corpse swell like a sausage. They didn't know that receding skin made fingernails and hair look longer. They just knew they buried Uncle Gregor last week, and now he looks suspiciously fresh. Worse, his mouth has blood on it. The explanation? He came back. He fed. He'll do it again unless someone stops him. So they did. They dug up the body. They inspected it. And depending on how offended they were by what they saw, they initiated one of several anti-vampire protocols. A wooden stake through the chest. Not the heart, necessarily. Just anywhere that might pin the thing down like a particularly threatening memo. A brick in the mouth. Prevents chewing. Allegedly. Decapitation. Director. Effective. Cathartic. Burial upside down. The theory being, if it tries to dig out, it goes the wrong way. Which is frankly brilliant. This wasn't random hysteria. This was ritualized fear. A fear that death might not stick. That grief could grow legs. That something under the ground might still be hungry. And the world at the time didn't exactly calm those fears. Plagues were sweeping across towns with no warning. People died in days, sometimes hours. No one knew why. Whole families gone. Survivors coughing, bleeding, collapsing. felt supernatural, because to them, it was. That's when names started to appear. In Romania, they were Strigoi. In Germany, Nachtzehrer. In Eastern Slavic regions, Upir. And in places without a proper term, that thing with the mouth. These weren't just legends, they were diagnoses. When someone wasted away mysteriously. When too many dreams ended in screaming. When the goats started acting weird. The villagers knew what to do. They made a list. They picked a suspect. And they dug. In 1725, in the village of Kisilova, now in Serbia, things escalated. A man named Petar Plagojevich died. Within 8 days, 9 others followed. Villagers reported seeing him walking through town at night, pale, silent, unhelpful. The Austrian authorities got involved. They exhumed the body. It was undecayed, according to their report. Blood around the mouth, still flexible. So they did what anyone would do, staked it through the chest on the spot. Official government business. Vampire elimination. Filed and stamped. But that wasn't the only method. Some regions believed that the dead could be distracted. You could scatter poppy seeds, rice, or sand over a grave, and the restless corpse would be forced to count every grain before it could rise. It's the kind of lore that reads like horror, written by someone who once babysat a particularly anxious accountant. Still, it worked. Not because it stopped vampires, but because it gave people control. Something to do, something to believe. Because vampires weren't just monsters, they were metaphors for death, for disease, for guilt, for grief that didn't stay in its place. And when fear becomes too heavy, we give it teeth, we give it rules, we bury it, we stab it. We tell ourselves that if we follow the ritual, the dead will stay quiet. But of course, they didn't. And soon, those grave crawlers would learn to clean up, move out of the village, and start knocking politely on the front doors of polite society. By the 18th century, vampires were already causing enough of a stir to make governments nervous. Villagers were still digging up bodies. Clergy were still overseeing exorcisms with all the enthusiasm of someone who knew this was probably going to end up in a report. And the vampire, once a swollen grave thing with a strong jaw and worse hygiene, was about to go through a bit of a makeover. It started slowly, as these things tend to. You see, most folklore monsters stay local. They're tied to a forest, a mountain, or a village too small to make it onto any map without squinting. But vampires, they traveled. They followed the plague, the trade routes, the soldiers, and the stories. And the further they traveled, the more they changed. By the time the vampire reached Western Europe, it started shedding some of its more rural characteristics. Less mud-caked corpse-chewing goats. More mysterious stranger with intense eye contact and a tragic backstory. Enter the aristocratic vampire, a creature shaped not just by fear, but by fiction. In 1819, a man named John Polidori published a short story called The Vampire. It's widely considered the first work of English literature to portray the vampire as a suave, seductive nobleman. Polidori based his pale bloodsucker on Lord Byron, who, if you know anything about him, was already halfway to vampire status just by being himself. This was a turning point. The vampire went from rotting villager who needs a good staking to dangerous man with good cheekbones and better posture. The story was a hit. It paved the way for a wave of literature that began to reshape the vampire myth into something more psychological and far more attractive. Then came Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, the definitive work of gothic vampire fiction. Stoker didn't invent vampire lore, but he polished it, translated it, and added real estate. His Dracula was foreign, aristocratic, educated, undead, and oddly concerned with English women's necks. And more importantly, he lived in a castle. That's when everything changed. The vampire was no longer just a rural corpse problem. He was now a symbol of foreign invasion, of sexual danger, of class anxiety, of disease, of desire, of all the things that made polite Victorian society deeply uncomfortable, but couldn't stop reading. Dracula had rules. He hated sunlight, slept in a coffin, transformed into mist or wolves, needed permission to enter, could be killed with a stake, or sometimes not at all, depending on which version you were reading. These rules weren't ancient. Most were invented or borrowed by Stoker. But once they were on the page, they stuck. Fiction codified the vampire, and pop culture never looked back. From that point on, the vampire stopped being a walking symptom of grief and became a leading man. In the early 20th century, he hit the stage and the silent film screen. Nosferatu, 1922, was a legally distinct Dracula ripoff, pale, hunched, long-fingered. Basically your landlord if he lived in a bell tower. Creepy, unattractive, very effective. But Hollywood soon realized something. Vampires didn't need to be grotesque. They could be charming. They could sell tickets. They could flirt. So they cleaned him up. In 1931, Bela Lugosi's Dracula arrived in a pressed tuxedo, with a Hungarian accent, a hypnotic stare, and a widow's peak so sharp it could cut glass. He didn't snarl. He spoke, slowly, calmly, intimately. Audiences swooned, and the modern vampire was officially born. What followed was nearly a century of transformation. Vampires became romantic, tragic, cursed, sexy, tortured, misunderstood. They became metaphors for addiction, near dark. Puberty, let the right one in. Repressed desire, interview with the vampire, consumer culture, the hunger, and at one point, baseball, Twilight. Not all of it made sense, but it didn't need to, because vampires, more than any other monster, have always been flexible. They are mirrors. They reflect whatever we're afraid of or attracted to at any given time. And they wear it well. One century, they're disgusting. The next, they're dateable. Sometimes both. But underneath the cape and collarbone, the ancient fear remains. That death can rise. That hunger has no end. And that the stranger at your door, smiling, pale, and too polite, might not be a stranger at all. So, you've got a vampire problem. Not the kind that shows up looking like a sewage balloon and causes a shovel-based emergency. No, you've upgraded. You're now dealing with the social version, the vampire with a name, a wardrobe, an accent. The kind who seduces, vanishes, and drinks your blood without so much as wrinkling his cravat. And here's the twist. He's very polite about it. This is one of the strangest developments in vampire lore. The sudden appearance of rules, rituals, legal frameworks, things the undead apparently have to follow or else lose their license to haunt. Let's start with the most famous one. You have to invite them in. Ask anyone what they know about vampires, and this rule shows up almost immediately. They can't enter your home unless you invite them. Seems simple, right? But where did it come from? Well, mostly from fiction. This concept isn't present in most early vampire folklore. Those muddy, bloated revenants didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just sort of showed up and ruined things. But by the time vampires became literary figures, particularly in Dracula, this rule appears, and it sticks. And what a rule it is. On the surface, it's a boundary, a layer of protection, a clear message. If you don't say yes, the vampire can't come in. But underneath that, it's a metaphor. Think about it. This is a creature defined by desire. Forbidden, uncomfortable, often dangerous desire. And now the story is telling you, it only gets in if you say yes. If you open the door, if you let your guard down, if you want it, even just a little. The invitation rule isn't about safety. It's about culpability. It's not the vampire's fault. You let it in. Neat trick, isn't it? A supernatural being that also absolves itself of responsibility. It makes monsters into metaphors, and metaphors into something much more dangerous. Also, it adds excellent drama to otherwise boring door scenes. Another ritual that emerges over time is the vampire's obsession with their resting place. In Dracula, the Count must sleep in consecrated soil from his homeland, a detail that adds both logistical challenges and unintentional comedy to an otherwise terrifying being. He's an immortal predator of the night, but only if his shipping crate full of Transylvanian topsoil arrives on time. In Folklore, this rule didn't exist. Corpses just rose from their graves and went about their grim business. But in Victorian and Gothic fiction, sleep becomes symbolic. The vampire sleeps like the dead because, technically, he is. Coffins become chambers. Tombs become bedrooms. Suddenly, this monster isn't just alive. He's trying to live like a person, a rich person, and in trying to look civilized, he becomes scarier. Today, vampires and sunlight don't mix. Instant death, flames, ash, end scene. But that wasn't always true. In earlier folklore, vampires could walk in daylight. They didn't love it. They weren't tanning and sipping lemonade. But they didn't explode. In fact, many were only marginally inconvenienced by the sun. Some just felt tired, like the undead version of jet lag. The deadly sunlight trope was invented by Hollywood, most notably in Nosferatu, 1922. In that film, the vampire Count Orlok dies dramatically in the rising sun. Why? Because the filmmakers needed an ending. It worked. The imagery was strong, symbolic. The light of reason, of God, of goodness, destroying the darkness. And audiences loved it, so it stuck. Now, every vampire franchise picks a lane. Buffy, dusted instantly. Twilight, glitter. Interview with the Vampire, fire and sadness. What We Do in the Shadows, comedy and sunscreen. Now let's talk mirrors. Why don't vampires have reflections? It's not because they're shy. It's because, historically, mirrors were backed with silver, a metal associated with purity and the divine. Vampires, being unclean and unholy, can't be seen in it. Simple as that. Same with garlic. Its strong smell, its use in folk medicine, and its symbolism of health and protection made it a natural vampire repellent. Then there's holy water, crosses, running water, rosaries, thresholds, and blessed bread, all of which have been used at various points to slow, harm, or stop vampires in their tracks. You know what that is? That's a checklist, a weird little bureaucracy of fear. Do you have your crucifix? Good. Garlic? Even better. Holy water? Splash sparingly. No, not like that. Okay, he's mad now. The deeper you go into vampire lore, the more it starts to resemble policy, as if the monster is less of a threat and more of a process, a puzzle, a haunted puzzle box with fangs. And humans, being who we are, responded the only way we know how, by making a system out of it. But why all the rules? Simple. Because rules give you hope. If a monster has no rules, there's no defense. You're just prey. But if a monster has guidelines, if it sleeps during the day, if it can't cross a threshold, If it's allergic to garlic, then you have options. You can plan. You can prepare. You can survive. And more than anything, you can pretend that you're in control. That's what vampire rules are really about. Not the monster, us. They're a way of making death manageable, grief predictable, trauma ritualized. They give us something to do with our hands when the world stops making sense. And that's the great trick of the vampire myth. It's always changing, but always familiar. Terrifying, but explainable. Dangerous, but polite enough to knock. You just have to say no. Unless, of course, you don't. The vampire, unlike many of its monster cousins, has a talent that borders on suspicious. It knows how to stay relevant. You'd think a myth that started with bloated, red-faced corpses chewing on grave shrouds would eventually run out of appeal. But no, it adapts. It reinvents. It rebrands. And somehow, it always finds a way back into the spotlight with a new haircut and a different metaphor. This isn't just survival, it's strategy. Vampires are shapeshifters, not just biologically, but culturally. They reflect whatever era they're in, slipping into new forms like they're updating their wardrobe for the next century. They've been symbols of disease, aristocracy, sin, repression, addiction, immigration, capitalism, and teen heartbreak. Sometimes all at once, depending on the lighting and soundtrack. In the 19th century, as the world industrialized and anxieties about class and outsiders grew louder, the vampire put on a cape and moved into a castle. Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was a symbol of foreign corruption, noble decay, and vaguely erotic danger. He had rules, manners, and just enough mystery to make everyone deeply uncomfortable. Later, as literature turned inward and more psychological, the vampire followed suit. It stopped lurking and started brooding. It got lonely. It questioned its existence. It quoted poetry and began writing in journals. The horror didn't go away. It just learned to whisper. Vampires became protagonists, anti-heroes. They were still dangerous, but now you understood why. They weren't just dead. They were damaged. And then, of course, came the leather. By the late 20th century, vampires were done sulking in castles. They had moved into nightclubs, dive bars, and extremely dramatic abandoned warehouses. They wore sunglasses indoors, carried swords, and smoked cigarettes they couldn't actually metabolize. These were vampires with attitude, rebels, loners, punks. Still immortal, still hungry, but now doing it with a soundtrack and surprisingly good lighting. And just when you thought they'd peaked, enter the sparkles. The vampire's early 2000s makeover was perhaps its most divisive. Suddenly, it was in high school. It was dating humans. It was abstaining from human blood and writing love letters. It wasn't just sad now. It was sparkly. And while certain corners of the horror community collectively screamed, millions of readers and future fan fiction authors were fully on board. Because whether or not you liked it, the vampire had done it again. It had found a new audience. It had stayed relevant. It had made immortality marketable. This time to teenagers, merch departments, and film studios with excellent cheekbone budgets. But even that wasn't the end. As the glitter settled and the romantic dust cleared, vampires began creeping back into darker spaces again. Recent interpretations have leaned toward the existential. Lonely creatures watching centuries pass, trying to make peace with what they are. They feed not out of malice, but out of necessity. They mourn their humanity. They self-isolate, and they still occasionally seduce. The vampire's power is that it can be anything we need it to be. Predator, lover, victim, metaphor. It slips between genres, styles, and cultural moods without ever losing that core truth. It is something that should be gone, but isn't. It survives because it evolves, because it listens, because it changes clothes faster than any other monster in the canon. It is fear in formal wear, hunger with manners, death, but attractive. And no matter what era it enters, no matter how many times it's reimagined, the vampire always manages to feel both familiar and just a little too close. It doesn't knock, it waits, it adapts. And if you look out the window long enough, you'll probably catch its reflection. Or maybe not. Depends on the version. So now you know, the vampire didn't start in castles or candlelight. It started in cold graves and colder fears, in villagers who needed a reason for why the dead didn't stay quiet, in whispers that turned into stories, that turned into legends, that turned into something you can't quite look away from. The file's closed, for now, but the archive never truly locks. Some stories don't stay put, no matter how deep you file them. There are other creatures still waiting, quiet, half forgotten, humming beneath the floorboards of old history. We'll get to them soon enough. For now, the candles are burning low. The wind just shifted, and something, just barely, knocked on the window. Sleep well, if you can.